Welcome back. You're still watching The Globe on the SABC News Channel. The Minneapolis police officer who allegedly caused the death of African-American George Floyd by kneeling on his neck will be charged with murder and manslaughter. Derek Chauvin was arrested earlier today. The incident was captured on video and has led to violent riots in the city and protests in other parts of the U.S. To get a sense of what America is going through at this moment, we're now joined via Skype by John Raphling, who's a senior researcher, Human Rights Watch U.S. program. Thanks so much for joining us. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
All right, so sadly, if one reads Barack Obama's latest tweet, perhaps what's happened to Mr. Floyd shouldn't surprise us.
Sadly is right. What happened to Mr. Floyd happens every day in the United States.
So explain to us what is it? What is behind this? You know, you hear stories about how people of color are treated by the authorities. Is this, I don't know, an institutional racism within the police forces?
The short answer is yes. There is institutional racism. There's also individual and personal racism that comes out more in varying degrees among officers and within departments. And there's institutional racism within the broader society in the United States, and that has a great impact on how police treat Black people, Latino people in this country. So the institutional racism goes well beyond policing. We have a highly segregated society, and the color lines additionally break down along wealth lines. When you compare various poverty factors, unemployment, life expectancy, just wealth in general, between Black and white, the differences are huge. And much of the job of policing in the United States is essentially to enforce those differences, to protect wealth, which means that their enforcement is directed very much at Black communities, brown communities, low-income communities.
How long has this been a problem in the United States? You know, I mean, I'm old enough to remember the early 70s, late 60s. My parents talked about, and of course, the civil rights movement. I mean, one could almost understand it in that era. But we're in 2020. What has happened over time? Well,
so your first question, how long has it been going on? It's been going on as long as the United States has been in existence. The racial violence has been part of our history and part of our culture, up to through the 60s and 70s, the civil rights movement, including to this day. While there's been progress, essentially, there's been progress and some of the legal rules have changed. For example, legalized segregation no longer exists. The laws have changed, but the actual facts on the ground haven't necessarily changed. There's still, there's still segregation. There's still segregation between races, and there's still the problems of extreme poverty particularly in Black communities in the United States. And the policing follows that, and the policing, as I said before, enforces it. One of the things that's changed is the advent of video. You know, when I used to be a practicing lawyer handling police misconduct cases, and you know, when I started, every now and then there would be a video. Now, a lot of cases are covered with video, and with social media, they become broadcasts, worldwide, and so that raises a great deal of attention to these issues. So that's a significant change, but in terms of the actual facts and the way policing is conducted, it's hard to say that there's been a meaningful change.
You know, I'm wondering, a police officer gets trained, gets into the police force, and one would think that one of the things that you get trained on early on, given all these incidents that have happened over time, is to be more sensitive to these kinds of things. What is going wrong from that moment of coming into the police force, being trained, being made aware? Because I don't think anybody can say that they don't know that the police are already being watched. And yet we keep on seeing the same kind of behavior.
Right. Well, so one thing is that the training itself often lends towards an aggressive and violent approach. The training tells officers that their lives are at risk at all times, particularly when they're dealing with people of color. Their training teaches them how to justify the use of force and violence. And that's sadly a fact of the way policing is done. But, you know, then the question is, right, I mean, this officer knows he's being watched, knows he's being filmed, and doesn't change what he does at all, which partly leads me to think he's going to say that he was just following his training, and he will probably point to something within his training that supports what he did. One. And two is there's never any consequences. Right? The police departments and local government cover for officers when they do things like this all the time. Right? We don't know. We know there have been a couple of complaints against this guy. We don't really know his history, and generally that history is kept secret. The department will litigate these cases. It's very rare. The fact that he's having charges filed against him is incredibly unusual. In Los Angeles County, where I live, there have been hundreds of killings by police in the county over the past 20 years. And I don't believe anyone's been prosecuted. Maybe one, maybe two. I had a case that I handled as a lawyer in which there was video of the police officer shooting the guy in the back, and they didn't prosecute that case. So partly is the officers, even when they're being filmed, they have a sense of impunity. They have a sense that no one's going to, that their superiors are going to back them up. The state is going to back them up because they're doing what they perceive they're supposed to do, which is forcefully keep people, particularly people in the Black community, down.
We start to see a lot of movements coming to the fore, hashtag Black Lives Matter. Are these making a difference? Again, you know, I almost start to think about this is the 60s, 70s playing out again in the 21st century.
Sure, and the Black Lives Matter movement has been extremely powerful and has shifted the debate and discussion. It's also, there's been a backlash. You know, President Trump has made a lot of political points with his white base by putting down the Black Lives Matter movement, by unconditionally supporting the police, by actually encouraging police to use violence, which is not to say that it's just a Republican like Trump. A supposedly liberal, even progressive Democrat like the mayor of New York City supported and resisted any consequence for an officer who choked Eric Garner to death a few years back. You know, so it's the both sides of the political establishment have been very, very resistant to any accountability for police and to any sort of changing in their role. And so that brings up the importance of movements like Black Lives Matter, and there's local movements that are similar or have similar goals and raising similar issues throughout the country that are, especially on the local level, moving the debate and moving towards accountability, and especially towards the idea of limiting the authority and the responsibility of the police.
All right, so a lot of these police forces have a good number of black, brown police officers. Are they just outnumbered, or are their voices drowned out when they see their fellow police officers doing things like this?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, right? The integration of the racial integration of the police departments and how much difference is made. I do think that to some degree, Black officers are more culturally sensitive to the Black community, and in some places are less likely to be aggressive. And in some cases, they're not. We see acts of violence by Black officers on Black people often. So there's value to the integration of the police departments, but that's not solving the problem. The problem is more structural and what the role of policing is in American society.
So when we see these riots playing out post this event with Mr. Floyd being, killed at the hands of the police, is this more about what's been happening generally, that this event is more symbolic rather than these riots are about this specific and this one event?
Right. So there have been sort of uprisings throughout the country, and each city where there have been uprisings have had their own killings by police recently. I mean, just earlier this week here in Los Angeles County, 2 different police agencies each killed somebody. So yes, the killing of George Floyd is a triggering event. The video is incredibly graphic, and it's really horrifying just in how deliberately this officer kills him as the spectators are begging him to let the guy go or even just to check his pulse. And so that's an incredibly angering thing. But what it triggers is what's going on every day. What's going on every day, particularly in Black and brown communities, not just the killings by police, but the daily harassment and humiliation of stops and searches, the requirement of obedience and submission at the price of a beating and possibly death. Those things all build up. And so when you have something that's so triggering as the killing of George Floyd, the killing of I'm forgetting the name of the woman who was a paramedic who was killed in either Kentucky or Tennessee. I'm forgetting the state that happened just, I think, a week or within the past couple of weeks. All this is building up, coupled with the frustration that over the years, every effort to get some accountability, to trust the system to work, has failed.
All right, so going forward, what happens next? Do people on either side of these attitudes harden their hearts, and that makes it harder to try and find that middle ground where healing will come?
So there has to be a major change, and there has to be a reparation. There has to be something done to improve the situation, to address the underlying poverty, to address the quality of life, and to stop resolving problems that we have in this country related to poverty by simply sending the police at these problems. And what typically happens is we get a horrible incident like this that sort of captures the public attention and brings about great protest. And then we get these sort of halfway little reforms that don't really change anything. And so if we're ever going to actually make progress, we have to move beyond these sort of mild reforms that are really more about public relations than about changing the way the police deal with the public. We need to empower local communities. We need to address public safety, not simply by having the police run through the neighborhood and harass all of the young men, but by dealing with employment opportunities, by providing for health and education and things of that matter. So until we do that, it's just going to be an endless cycle of reaction and action and reaction.
All right. John Raphling, thanks so much indeed for spending some time with us and just explaining some of the nuances, I guess, of what's playing out and the scenes that we've been seeing this week. Thanks so much indeed for your insights.
Oh, well, thank you for having me.
All right, that's John Raphling with Human Rights Watch US program, talking to us about some of the violence that we've seen this week at the hands of police killing an African American. And just to give you some alarming statistics, it's believed that African Americans are 2.5 more times likely to be killed by police than white people, and black women 1.5 more times more likely. We'll have more on The Globe after this.